October 1935. In a Newark hospital bed, notorious gangster Dutch Schultz lay dying from multiple gunshot wounds. Among the last messages he received was a terse telegram. As ye sow, so shall you reap. Signed, Madame Queen. The sender was Stephanie St. Clair, Harlem's famed, numbers queen, delivering a final, defiant epitaph to the man who had tried to destroy her. For years, St. Clair and her protege, Ellsworth, Bumpy Johnson, had waged war against Schultz's attempt to hijack Harlem's lucrative underground lottery. Their struggle was fierce and bloody, a collision of two worlds, the established black run numbers, rackets of Harlem versus the violent incursion of outside organized crime. And remarkably, the black entrepreneurs prevailed at least long enough for fate and the mafia to take Schultz out of the picture. This script dives deep into the true history of Bumpy Johnson and the powerful woman he worked for, Madame Stephanie St. Clair. It is a story grounded entirely in historical fact, drawn from newspaper archives, biographies, and law enforcement records with no Hollywood embellishment. We'll explore how a West Indian immigrant woman built an illegal gambling empire in the 1920s, stood up to both corrupt police and Italian Jewish mobsters, and mentored a young Harlem tough who would become a legendary crime boss in his own right. We'll trace Bumpy's journey from his humble Southern beginnings to the peak of his reign in Harlem, and how popular media has distorted their legacy, often glorifying Bumpy as the godfather of Harlem, while erasing the pivotal role of Madame St. Clair. So, let's step back in time to early 20th century Harlem, a world of policy bankers and bootleggers, of thriving black businesses shadowed by systemic racism, to meet the real Bumpy Johnson and the queen of the Harlem underworld who helped make him. Our journey begins not in New York, but in the Deep South, where Bumpy Johnson's story first took shape. Ellsworth Raymond Bumpy Johnson was born on October 31st, 1905, in Charleston, South Carolina. He earned the nickname Bumpy as a boy thanks to a prominent bump on the back of his head, a physical quirk that would stick with him for life. Charleston in the early 1900s was a place of deeply ingrained racial oppression. South Carolina, as one writer noted, was then, and remains to this day, among the most reactionary states in America. Johnson's family directly confronted this harsh reality when Bumpy's older brother Willie was accused of killing a white man. Fearing lethal retaliation from a lynch mob, the family hastily sent 10-year-old Bumpy north to Harlem for his safety. Arriving in New York around 1915-17 and later living with his sister Mabel in 1919, young Bumpy found that racism took other, more subtle forms in the North. In the bustling black enclave of Harlem, he was a skinny Southern kid with a thick Gullah accent, an easy target for teasing. But Bumpy had a volatile temper and refused to be bullied. He fought back fiercely, quickly earning a reputation as a scrappy fighter who was unafraid to hurt those who crossed him. By his teens, school held little interest. Bumpy dropped out of high school and worked odd jobs, spending more time on the streets, soaking up the vibrant and sometimes dangerous street life of 1920s Harlem. Harlem in this era was the capital of Black America's cultural renaissance, but it also had a thriving underworld. Prohibition was in full swing, speakeasies and nightclubs flourished, and an illegal lottery known as the policy, or numbers, game had become a daily pastime for many Harlemites. For a sharp kid with a taste for excitement, the underworld offered both opportunity and peril. Bumpy gravitated toward the neighborhood tough guys and gangsters. By his late teens, he had caught the eye of William Bub Hewlett, a prominent Harlem gangster. Hewlett took young Bumpy under his wing, employing him as a muscle for hire, a bodyguard for the high-rolling gamblers who ran Harlem's thriving backroom dice games and betting parlors. Through this apprenticeship, Bumpy gained entry into the shadowy fraternity of Harlem's racketeers. He was learning the ropes of extortion, protection rackets, and the brutal enforcement that kept the underworld in line. Yet, these early illicit successes came at a cost. Bumpy Johnson's criminal exploits, which by his own later accounts included burglary, theft, and pimping, soon landed him in serious trouble. In the mid-1920s, while still very young, he was arrested and convicted on a felony accounts vary, but likely for a violent crime or grand larceny. The consequence was severe, a long stint in prison. In fact, by the time he was 30 years old, Bumpy had spent roughly half his life behind bars. One stretch in the late 1920s saw him serve nearly a decade in prison, keeping him out of the action during some formative years of Harlem's underworld. Behind bars, Ellsworth Johnson further hardened himself. He nurtured his intellect as well, reading voraciously, studying history and philosophy. In later years, he would surprise people by casually quoting Shakespeare and educating young hustlers about classical literature, earning the ironic nickname, the Professor, for his bookish interests. This mix of street toughness and intellect would become a hallmark of Bumpy's persona. But in 1932, as the Great Depression ravaged the country and new criminal opportunities emerged in the illegal gambling trade, Bumpy Johnson stepped back onto the streets of Harlem as an ex-convict, broke, jobless, but hungry to make his mark. Little did he know that a fateful meeting with Harlem's reigning queen of the policy rackets was about to change his life. Decades before Bumpy Johnson became a household name in Harlem, Stephanie St. Clair had already established herself as one of the neighborhood's most intriguing and powerful figures. Born around the late 19th century, St. Clair's early life is somewhat shrouded in mystery, partly by design, as she often cultivated her own mythology. According to historian LaShawn Harris, St. Clair was likely born on the French, Caribbean island of Guadeloupe. Some accounts say Martinique or even mainland France in the mid-1880s or 1890s. She later vehemently claimed to be of French-European heritage, distancing herself from Caribbean origins in what may have been a bid for greater respectability in racist American society. What is clear is that as a young woman, she was ambitious and unafraid to forge a new path. In 1911, St. Clair left the Caribbean for Canada, possibly working as a domestic in Montreal. And by 1912, she had arrived in New York City, one more black immigrant seeking opportunity in the promised land of Harlem. If Harlem was the land of opportunity, mainstream avenues for a black woman in the 1910s were severely limited. St. Clair likely worked menial jobs at first, but she was clever and assertive, with an eye for the main chance. Sometime in the early 1920s, amid the Harlem Renaissance and the economic boom of the Jazz Age, Stephanie Satine, Clair found her calling in the underground economy of policy banking. By 1923, at about 24 years old, she was working in the illegal lottery racket known locally as playing the numbers. How she got the startup capital remains debated. One story, perhaps apocryphal, claims she hit the numbers big herself several times, making a half-dozen killings at the betting parlors. Another documented account shows that in 1923 she won a $100,000 judgment in a civil lawsuit against a landlord who had illegally evicted her. She may have reinvested that windfall straight into her nascent business. However she did it, Mad-Eye St. Clair built a gambling empire from scratch in a field almost entirely dominated by men. By the late 1920s, St. Clair had become Harlem's preeminent female numbers banker, widely known as Madame Queen, or the Numbers Queen. Her operation was impressive in scale and efficiency. She employed 40 to 50 numbers runners, along with teams of controllers, clerks, and even bodyguards and enforcers. Each day, her army of runners fanned out across Harlem's bars, barbershops, and street corners, collecting pennies, nickels, and dimes from thousands of hopeful bettors. They recorded 3-digit number combinations on small slips of paper, clandestine tickets in the lottery. The bets were turned in to St. Clair's headquarters, a numbers bank, where a controller would tally the wagers. Each evening, a winning number was determined by a publicly published source, often an astronomical or financial figure, to keep the game honest. Winners might get a 600 to 1 payout, but the real money was made by the bankers. The house Madame St. Clair kept most of the cash, and business was booming. Contemporary estimates of St. Clair's success were jaw-dropping. In 1930, one Harlem newspaper pegged her personal fortune at around 500,000 cash, equivalent to nearly $8 million today, and noted that she owned several apartment houses in Harlem outright. Harris writes that St. Clair was likely earning at least $200,000 per year in profits by the late 1920s. She took up residence in a luxury building at 409 Edgecombe Avenue, known as the Castle on Sugar Hill, which was home to Harlem's black elite, W.E.B. Du Bois, Thurgood Marshall, and other luminaries lived there. But even among such esteemed neighbors, Madame St. Clair stood out. As one awestruck resident recalled, she would come breezing through the lobby with her fur coat dramatically flowing behind her, wearing exotic dresses with a colorful turban wrapped around her head. Sape. Claire's flamboyant style and mysterious aura made her a local legend. She did not hide what she did for a living. On the contrary, she gloried in her status. Harlem knew that the stylish lady in the chauffured car was the reigning numbers queen. Importantly, Stephanie St. Clair was more than just a racketeer interested in riches. She was also a savvy community figure and a defiant advocate for Harlem's black residents, in an era when many black leaders preached respectability and obeying the law to uplift the race. Stained. Clair took a different, more audacious approach. She used her wealth and influence in the 1920s to fight back against oppression, albeit on her own terms. For example, in 1929 she paid for bold newspaper advertisements in the New York Amsterdam News, Harlem's leading black paper, advising black citizens of their civil rights. Her ads educated people to refuse illegal searches by police and not to be intimidated without a warrant. She publicly accused the NYPD of misconduct and harassment, an act of remarkable courage for a black woman of that time. St. Clair also co-founded the French-American Legal Defense League, a group aimed at supporting Caribbean immigrants in New York. She made a point of hiring local black residents in her enterprises, not just as numbers runners, but as domestic workers, chauffeurs, seeping to spread the wealth. In these ways, Madame Sape, Clair straddled the line between criminality and community activism. She was running an illegal lottery, yes, but she also framed herself as a protector and benefactor of Harlem, a woman who took part in ongoing conversations about racial advancement, even as she operated outside the law. By the end of the Roaring Twenties, St. Clair's success inevitably drew unwanted attention both from law enforcement and from jealous rivals. The turning point came in late 1929, just weeks after the Wall Street crash. On December 30, 1929, St. Clair was arrested by the NYPD during a raid on one of her policy offices, caught with ledgers and numbers slips in hand. It was the first time the Queen of Numbers faced serious jail time. True to form, she handled it with dramatic flair. The very next day, January 1, 1930, while out on bail, St. Clair paid for a full-page editorial in the Amsterdam News to broadcast her side of the story. Dripping with sarcasm, she wrote, "I have been arrested and framed by 3 of the bravest and noblest cowards who wear civilian clothes." A direct shot at the police detectives who busted her. This public taunt infuriated the NYPD. At her trial in March 1930, prosecutors painted St. Clair as an incorrigible criminal, while she is acting as her own attorney, turned the courtroom into a stage. She freely admitted to being a numbers banker, but argued she was targeted because of her fight for courtesy and freedom from annoyance by the police. She testified for hours about how she had paid off police in the past and was now being punished for cutting certain cops out of the profits. It was an explosive allegation that corrupt officers had profited from her operation for years, and it left the courtroom stunned. Nevertheless, the judge and jury were not swayed by her bravado. Stephanie St. Clair was convicted and sentenced to 8 months and 20 days on Welfare Island, the women's workhouse for the policy racket. For nearly a year, Harlem's numbers queen sat in a jail cell, but she was anything but defeated. If anything, prison sharpened St. Clair's resolve to expose the corruption between the NYPD and the underworld. Upon her release in late 1930, she became a whistleblower. That December, dressed impeccably in furs and feathers, Madame St. Clair took the stand before the prestigious Seabury Commission, a high-profile state investigation into police graft and judge fixing. In front of this official body, she did the unthinkable. She named names. Clair coolly testified that over the years she had sent regular payments of $100 and $500 to an NYPD lieutenant in the 6th Division and had paid cops roughly $6,000 in total to buy protection for her numbers business. Her detailed testimony was believed, and it caused a scandal. As a direct result, 13 police officers, including a police lieutenant, were suspended for corruption. The NYPD, embarrassed and now on notice, could no longer afford to ignore Madame St. Clair's voice. Through sheer boldness, she had turned her status as a convicted gambler into that of a crusader against police corruption. But even as St. Clair was battling the police in 1930, a new, far more dangerous threat was gathering on the horizon. From beyond Harlem came hungry eyes, organized crime figures who saw an opportunity to seize the rich prize of the numbers racket. Chief among them was a ruthless young gangster from the Bronx Arthur, Dutch Schultz, Flegenheimer. By the early 1930s, the illegal numbers lottery in Harlem had grown into an enterprise generating millions of dollars in annual bets. It was the biggest underground economy in the neighborhood, and white mobsters took notice. The most aggressive of these was Dutch Schultz, a Jewish American gangster who had made his name and fortune as a Prohibition-era bootlegger. Schultz, described by one contemporary as one of the most dangerous criminals of the era, was as notorious for his vicious temper as for his business acumen. In the early 1930s, with Prohibition ending, Schultz sought new revenue streams, and Harlem's thriving numbers racket looked ripe for the picking. Backed by corrupt Tammany Hall politicians and a roster of over 100 gun-toting henchmen, Schultz made his move. He began sending emissaries uptown with a simple, thuggish proposition for the black policy bankers: hand over control or pay tribute. Those who refused were met with beatings or murder. Schultz paid off New York police to arrest independent operators who didn't fall in line, leveraging law enforcement as his personal enforcement squad. Harlem's numbers kings and queens suddenly faced a dire choice: sell out or be taken out. Many smaller operators caved, ceding their territory to Schultz's goons out of fear. But Stephanie St. Clair was not about to bow. Madame St. Clair publicly and vehemently declared war on Dutch Schultz. In press interviews, she blasted Schultz as a rat and boldly proclaimed, "I'm not afraid of Dutch Schultz or any other living man. He'll never touch me! I will kill Schultz if he sets foot in Harlem. The policy game is my game." Such uncompromising words from a black woman against a white gangster were virtually unheard of at the time. And St. Clair meant every word. She quickly organized a defense league of sorts among the remaining black numbers bankers who hadn't yet been terrorized into submission. Drawing inspiration from, by black, economic activism of the era, she launched a campaign urging Harlem residents to patronize only black run numbers games. Play black, her newspaper ads urged, imploring the community to keep their money away from Dutch Schultz's operations. She framed the fight as not just about gambling turf, but about black economic self-determination. In her view, allowing Schultz or any white interloper to conquer the numbers racket was an extension of Jim Crow, another way to exploit black people and drain wealth out of the community. St. Clair's resistance wasn't only in newspapers. She quite literally fought back in the streets. The Queen of Harlem armed her lieutenants and directed them to strike at Schultz's outlets. Black supporters of St. Clair barged into shops that doubled as betting drops for Schultz, smashing plate, glass display cases, and tearing up policy slips in dramatic fashion. On at least one occasion, St. Clair herself marched into a store and wreaked havoc, personally warning the frightened proprietors, these small timers, who had betrayed Harlem's own, to get out of the neighborhood. It was a fearless show of force from a woman who was by then in her 40s, taking on one of America's most fearsome gangsters. And Schultz took notice. Dutch Schultz responded to St. Clair's rebellion with pure terror. He had his men make threatening calls to St. Clair's house day and night. More tangibly, Schultz's thugs began kidnapping and murdering St. Clair's associates one by one. Being a numbers runner or enforcer for Madame Queen had suddenly become a very dangerous job. Bodies of those who defied, the Dutchmen, started turning up. Finally, Schultz put the word out on the street. He was offering a bounty for anyone who could kill Stephanie St. Clair. With a price on her head, St. Clair was forced to go into hiding. In her own later account, she described spending days concealed in the coal cellar of a friend's building while Schultz's hitmen stalked the neighborhood. "I hid in a cellar while the super, a friend of mine, covered me with coal." She recalled of that close brush with death. Only by laying low could she evade the assassins roaming Harlem's streets. By mid-1932, the Harlem numbers war was in full blaze. The violence and chaos were spiraling, and it was at this critical juncture that Ellsworth, Bumpy Johnson entered the scene. Fresh out of prison in 1932 and back on the streets, Bumpy was a talented free agent in search of an opportunity. He found it in St. Clair's desperate fight against Schultz. Accounts vary as to how they met. Some say one of St. Clair's men introduced Bumpy to her, knowing she needed extra muscle. Others suggest Bumpy boldly sought her out, offering his services. Either way, in 1932, St. Clair took Bumpy Johnson under her wing. She had lost many of her own enforcers to Schultz's campaign of terror, and Bumpy's ferocity and toughness were welcome assets. By the time he turned 30, Bumpy had a reputation as a man who wasn't afraid to hurt people, and actually seemed to enjoy it. As one writer observed, that was exactly the kind of enforcer Madame St. Clair needed in her corner. Thus began one of Harlem's most storied partnerships. St. Clair made Bumpy her chief lieutenant and bodyguard, effectively placing her life in his protection. In return, Bumpy gained the patronage of Harlem's most influential underworld boss. He was now at the forefront of the fight against Dutch Schultz, and he threw himself into the battle with gusto. According to Harlem lore, later recounted by Bumpy's wife Mamie, Bumpy led a loyal crew of about 9 men in a guerrilla campaign against Schultz. They knew every alley and speakeasy in Harlem, and they used that home turf advantage to target Schultz's operatives. Picking off Dutch Schultz's men was easy. Mamie Johnson wrote, since there were few other white men walking around Harlem during the day. In effect, Bumpy and his small band became Harlem's insurgents, specializing in swift hit and run tactics. They kidnapped Schultz's collectors, intercepted his cash couriers, and on occasion simply gunned down his soldiers in the dark. Bumpy reportedly personally murdered or abducted over 40 of Schultz's people during this period, an incredible tally that underscored the brutality of the conflict. If Schultz's crew thought they could waltz into Harlem unopposed, Bumpy's ruthless reprisals taught them otherwise. Despite these efforts, the war was grueling and costly for St. Clair's side. By 1934, 2 years of violence had taken a toll. Many in Harlem were terrified. Some black bankers had capitulated to Schultz just to save their skins. The odds seemed stacked in Schultz's favor. He had endless resources, the backing of corrupt officials, and the open or tacit approval of the city's Italian mafias, who were content to see him deal with the Harlem problem. One contemporary observer noted that Schultz had the law on his side, while St. Clair and Bumpy were outgunned, and essentially fighting a losing battle. By 1935, Schultz effectively controlled a large share of Harlem's numbers racket, at least on the surface. Madame St. Clair, once the independent queen, found her revenues shrinking and her freedom constrained by the constant threat of assassination. Both she and Bumpy faced numerous arrests. Schultz saw to it that police kept harassing them. The situation was dire enough that St. Clair purportedly told Bumpy it might be time to retreat, to lay low, and let the storm pass. Little did anyone suspect. The violent saga was about to take a dramatic turn, not through any treaty or truce, but through the volatile whims of organized crime politics. Dutch Schultz, the beer baron of the Bronx, and self-proclaimed overlord of Harlem, was about to face judgment of a different kind. In the end, Dutch Schultz's worst enemy was not Stephanie St. Clair or Bumpy Johnson, it was Dutch Schultz himself. As the Harlem Numbers war raged, Schultz made a fatal error. He set his sights on assassinating Thomas E. Dewey, the special prosecutor for organized crime in New York. Dewey had been relentlessly pursuing Schultz for tax evasion and racketeering, and in Schultz's paranoid mind, eliminating Dewey seemed like a solution. But this plan horrified Schultz's fellow mob bosses. Charles, Lucky, Luciano, and the newly formed Mafia Commission feared that killing a high-profile prosecutor would bring the full wrath of the law on all their operations. So, in October 1935, they decided to eliminate Schultz first. On the night of October 23, 1935, while Dutch Schultz sat in the restroom of the Palace Choff House in Newark, hitmen from Murder, Inc. stormed in and shot him repeatedly. The Dutchman was fatally wounded. For 3 agonizing days, Arthur Flegenheimer, Schultz's real name, lingered in a hospital, delirious and dying. It was during this time that Stephanie St. Clair made her final, theatrical move. She sent a telegram to Schultz's bedside, succinct and biblical in its vengeance. As ye sow, so shall you reap. And she signed it, Madame Queen of Policy. St. Clair wanted her nemesis to know that she saw poetic justice in his violent end. Indeed, Schultz reportedly received the telegram while on his deathbed, an almost cinematic coda to their feud. On October 26, 1935, Dutch Schultz died of his wounds, marking the end of the Harlem Numbers War in the most unexpected way possible. Harlem's reaction was one of profound relief. The years-long reign of terror Schultz had inflicted was over. And while neither St. Clair nor Bumpy Johnson could claim to have personally vanquished Schultz, they had outlasted him. St. Clair, ever one for the last word, even took credit, Sebas in her own fashion, for resisting Schultz when others did not. In a later interview, she boasted, "I was the only Negro banker to fight Schultz. I fought him from 1931 to 1935, and it cost me 820 days in jail and $750,000. It was true that same." Clair had sacrificed much jail time, money, lives of friends in this struggle. But survival itself was a kind of victory. With Dutch out of the way, a power vacuum emerged in Harlem's underworld. The Italian mafia, under Lucky Luciano and his lieutenant Frank Costello, certainly intended to muscle in on the numbers trade now. But unlike Schultz, Luciano was a pragmatic businessman. He recognized that trying to rule Harlem by pure force had backfired on the Dutchman. Instead, Luciano approached the situation differently. He sought an alliance, and for that, he turned to the one man left standing with clout in Harlem's numbers game, Bumpy Johnson. At this juncture, Madame Saint Clair herself made a pivotal decision. Exhausted from years of fighting and under heat from law enforcement, who were now scrutinizing all policy bankers, Clair decided it was time to step back from the racket she had built. As one account describes, she was in desperate need to lay low and steer clear of authorities, after all the publicity. So, rather than contest the mafia's incursion, St. Clair chose a strategic retreat. In late 1935, she officially handed over control of her remaining numbers business to Bumpy Johnson. It was a passing of the torch, the end of Madam Queen's reign, and the beginning of Bumpy's. This transition was not without its complications. Bumpy Johnson was still relatively young, 30 years old, and black gangsters historically had never been on equal footing with the nationally connected Italian mob. But Bumpy was shrewd. In the wake of Schultz's death, he met with Lucky Luciano and negotiated a deal that would shape Harlem's underworld for decades. The terms, as later reported, were essentially a 50-50 partnership. Bumpy would remain the de facto controller of Harlem's numbers racket, the frontman and operations manager, while Luciano's syndicate would provide protection and take a cut of the profits. Bumpy, in effect, became an independent associate of the Luciano, later Genovese crime family, rather than a subordinate lackey. This was unprecedented, a black crime boss striking a business alliance with the Italian mafia at a near peer level. Not everyone in the community was happy about cutting the Italians in on Harlem's money, but many Harlemites saw the outcome as honorable given the alternatives. Bumpy had ended the brutal war without further bloodshed on their streets and had done so with no further losses to Harlem's people. One observer noted that this was the first time a black gang leader had successfully stood up to the white mob instead of just bowing down. It made Bumpy something of a folk hero in some quarters. Madame St. Clair, for her part, was content to exit the stage at this high point. In a show of mutual respect, she and Bumpy remained close. Years later, Bumpy's wife Mamie would recall that St. Clair affectionately referred to Ellsworth as her son, and trusted him to run things as she faded from public view. St. Clair even reportedly told a journalist that Bumpy protected me and protected my business, implying that he kept her interests and legacy alive after she left. With the war over, the Madame Queen of Harlem officially retired from the rackets. Her legend would live on in whispered stories, but she largely disappeared from the headlines after 1936. However, Stephanie St. Clair's life was not done with twists yet. The very next chapter for her would be a bizarre foray into love and violence that again landed her in prison, this time for an act of passion rather than business. Freed from the day-to-day stresses of running a criminal empire, Stephanie St. Clair attempted to reinvent herself in the late 1930s. Surprisingly, the next time she made national news was not for gambling or gang wars, but for a scandalous marriage and an attempted murder. In August 1936, the 49-year-old Saint Clair entered into a highly publicized union with a man named Sufi Abdul Hamid. Hamid was a charismatic Harlem figure, a self-styled activist and orator who preached black economic nationalism mixed with anti-Semitic diatribes, earning him the nickname Black Hitler in the press. He was born Eugene Brown in Massachusetts, not Egypt as he claimed, but he cut an impressive figure on Harlem's streets with his flowing cape, turban, and fiery speeches about black empowerment. The marriage between Madam Queen and Sufi Hamid was unconventional from the start. They signed a contract marriage, essentially a trial arrangement for 1 year, after which they could part ways or solemnize it legally if they chose. This arrangement made headlines across the black press. Readers were fascinated by the numbers Queen teaming up with the flamboyant activist. Some even thought they made a fascinating couple. But behind the scenes, the relationship was tumultuous. Within a year, it soared dramatically. Hamid was unfaithful, carrying on an affair with a younger woman, a Harlem fortune teller known as Fufu, Dorothy Matthews. When St. Clair discovered the betrayal, her notorious temper flared to lethal heights. On January 19, 1938, Stephanie St. Clair confronted Sufi Abdul Hamid at his office on 125th Street. A fierce argument erupted, and at some point St. Clair produced a handgun. In a flash, she fired 3 shots at Hamid. The bullets narrowly missed killing him. One even nicked his teeth, by Hamid's own account. St. Clair later claimed the gun went off during a struggle, or that she acted in self-defense after he mistreated her. Hamid, for his part, admitted publicly that given her fiery personality, he was not surprised she tried to shoot him. He revealed she had even threatened his life weeks prior when he tried to leave her. This domestic melodrama became headline news. The once mighty queen of policy now stood in court on charges of attempted murder. She was convicted, and the judge, referencing her lifelong notoriety, declared, "This woman has been living by her wits all of her life." In mid-1938, St. Clair was sentenced to 2 to 10 years in the Bedford Hills prison for women. Stephanie St. Clair spent roughly 2 years behind bars, finally gaining release in the early 1940s, likely by 1942. By then, Harlem and the world had changed. World War II was on, and St. Clair, now in her 50s, had no desire to return to the limelight or the risky racket that once made her rich. She quietly slipped into what she had once promised a secluded life. A 1943 Amsterdam News item noted that her whereabouts were not definitely known. She had apparently gone to the West Indies to visit family and then kept to herself upon returning to New York. For decades after, Madame St. Clair lived in obscurity. Bumpy Johnson, true to his word, ensured she was taken care of. According to Mamie Johnson, Bumpy's wife, St. Clair eventually relocated to a Long Island mansion and never again involved herself in the numbers business. Whether mansion is exaggeration or not, we do know that by 1960, Stephanie St. Clair was alive and financially comfortable. That year, a New York Post reporter, Ted Poston, tracked down the legendary policy queen for a retrospective on Harlem's bygone rackets. He found her living in Harlem once more, of all places, reportedly owning a lavish 4-story townhouse and enjoying the life of a prosperous businesswoman. Poston described St. Clair, then about 65 years old, as still proud and engaging, but now entirely legitimate in her ventures. It seems that Madame Queen had managed to invest or save enough to live her final years in relative luxury, proving that her black empowerment efforts worked out for her in the end. Stephanie St. Clair's long and colorful life quietly came to an end in 1969. Fittingly, the exact date and circumstances remain a bit murky, consistent with her tendency to wrap herself in mystery. Harris's research indicates St. Clair died in 1969 in a Long Island mental hospital, of all places. Intriguingly, not a single New York newspaper reported her death. The passing of the Queen of Numbers went unnoticed in the mainstream press, as if she were a forgotten footnote. But those in Harlem who knew the truth remembered Stephanie St. Clair as a trailblazer, a woman who had dared to dominate a man's world and thumb her nose at both the mob and the law. Her story might have faded from popular memory for a time, but it would not be gone forever. With Madame St. Clair stepping away in 1935, Ellsworth, Bumpy Johnson emerged as Harlem's reigning underworld figure. The Luciano deal cemented his status. Bumpy would run Harlem's gambling rackets as an allied but independent operator, paying the Italian mafia their agreed cut. This arrangement held for decades. As one writer put it, Bumpy essentially became the de facto king of Harlem, albeit a king who acknowledged a higher empire, the Mafiat above him. Under Bumpy's management, the numbers racket in Harlem continued to thrive through the late 1930s and 1940s. Gamblers trusted Bumpy. He was seen as a Harlem man who had brokered peace, and Bumpy carefully cultivated his Robin Hood image. He famously would walk through the neighborhood greeting working class folks, slipping a $50 bill to a struggling family here, paying a kid's tuition there. Every Thanksgiving he stood on street corners handing out free turkeys to the needy. People began referring to him, half in fear and half in affection, as the Godfather of Harlem. Indeed, while crime bosses like Lucky Luciano or Al Capone were reviled by the general public, Bumpy achieved a level of local folk hero status. Many Harlemites loved and respected him, even as they feared him. To them, Bumpy wasn't just a racketeer, he was their racketeer, a protector who kept predatory outsiders, like Dutch Schultz at bay, and sprinkled some of the illicit riches back into the community. Bumpy also broadened his underworld portfolio. By the late 1940s and 1950s, a new illicit trade was booming narcotics. Heroin in particular began flooding urban neighborhoods after DUI, and Harlem was no exception. Johnson himself long denied being a drug trafficker, but law enforcement believed otherwise. Federal investigations linked Bumpy to major dope suppliers. He was rumored to be involved in the infamous French Connection pipeline of heroin from Marseille to New York. His partnership with the Genovese crime family likely extended into these ventures, as the Italians needed local distributors. If numbers gambling had been Harlem's biggest hustle of the 30s, heroin became its scourge of the 50s, and Bumpy Johnson was right at the center of it, according to authorities. In 1951, the law finally caught up with him in a big way. Bumpy was arrested and indicted on numerous drug conspiracy charges. In 1952, Bumpy Johnson was convicted in federal court for conspiracy to distribute heroin. The judge threw the book at him, 15 years in federal prison. Bumpy was now in his late 40s, and it looked like his reign might be effectively over. He was shipped out to the infamous Alcatraz Penitentiary in San Francisco Bay, the Rock, to serve his time. Yet even behind bars, the Bumpy legend grew. Harlem residents whispered that their godfather was still pulling strings from prison. An extraordinary rumor even arose that Bumpy had been somehow involved in the great Alcatraz inmate escape of 1962. In June 1962, 3 prisoners made a daring Hollywood-worthy escape from Alcatraz, disappearing into the waters of the bay. Decades later, the FBI noted a report that Bumpy Johnson had arranged for a boat to pick up the escapees and ferry them to safety. It sounds like a tall tale, and indeed, no concrete evidence of Bumpy's involvement ever surfaced, but the mere fact his name was attached to the most legendary prison break in U.S. history speaks to his aura of influence. After serving nearly 11 years with some time off for good behavior, Ellsworth Johnson was released from prison in 1963. He returned home to Harlem to find a neighborhood much changed. The 1960s brought a new cultural wave, civil rights protests, and different criminal players, yet Bumpy's own reputation had not dimmed one bit. In fact, he was welcomed back with open arms. The day he came home, Harlem threw a parade in his honor. Thousands lined the streets to catch a glimpse of the returning King of Harlem. Bumpy, ever the showman, basked in the adulation even as he quipped that everything in Harlem had changed except the Apollo Theater. Now in his late 50s, Bumpy tried to reassert control over the Harlem underworld, but the landscape was shifting. By the mid-1960s, new younger gangsters like Frank Lucas, who had been a driver protege to Bumpy, and rival players like Nicky Barnes were on the rise, eager to dominate the heroin business. The Italian mob families were also fracturing and facing law enforcement heat. Bumpy managed to retain respect. He was the elder statesman of crime in Harlem, but it was a more complex, fragmented scene. He continued to handle illegal gambling and some narcotics, and he also opened a legitimate establishment or two as fronts. However, the constant police surveillance frustrated him greatly. Detectives tailed Bumpy everywhere, hoping to nail him for something new. In December 1965, This pressure led to one of Bumpy's most famous incidents. He walked into the 28th Precinct Station House and staged a sit-down protest. Bumpy simply sat on a bench and refused to budge, declaring he was tired of being hounded. The bewildered police eventually arrested him for refusal to leave a police station. In court, Bumpy argued it was a form of protest against harassment. The judge, perhaps amused or sympathetic, acquitted him of the bizarre charge. It was a small but symbolic victory for the aging gangster, one that even mainstream news outlets noted with a wink. By 1968, Bumpy Johnson had been Harlem's uncontested man in charge for over 30 years, bearing his prison absence. He had survived gang wars, outlived most of his old foes, and navigated the treacherous waters of mob politics. In an underworld where few die of natural causes, Bumpy was an anomaly. And indeed, his end came not by violence but by the hand of fate. In the early hours of July 7, 1968, Bumpy Johnson was enjoying a late night meal at Wells Restaurant, a favorite Harlem dining spot known for its chicken and waffles. He was in the company of a long-time friend when suddenly he collapsed. Ellsworth, Bumpy Johnson died of a massive heart attack right there in his beloved neighborhood at age 62. By some accounts, he died cradled in the arms of his old friend, Junie. Bird, other stories, popularized later, claim his new protege Frank Lucas was present and held him as he passed. Either way, it was a quiet exit, no hail of bullets, no final showdown. As writer Joe Queenan Riley observed, Bumpy's greatest achievement may well have been that unlike Luciano Assa deported, Schultz murdered, or Capone mad from syphilis, Johnson died a natural death, something nearly unheard of for an infamous gangster. Harlem mourned Bumpy Johnson in grand fashion. Some 2,000 people reportedly attended his funeral, packing the streets in open tribute. To the community, Bumpy's send-off was not just a burial. It was a coronation of memory. The mixed legacy of this complex man, both brutal criminal and local folk hero, was on full display as mourners wept and storytellers reminisced about his generosity. With Bumpy's death, an era truly ended. Harlem's underworld crown would be claimed by others, Frank Lucas among them, but none would capture the popular imagination the way Bumpy had. Over the years, the figure of Bumpy Johnson transformed from a real person into a larger, then life character in American pop culture. This transformation, however, often distorted the reality of who he was and what he actually did. Hollywood and fiction writers found Bumpy's story irresistible, the eloquent, chess playing gangster in fine suits, walking the line between brutality and benevolence. But in adapting his life to the screen, they frequently took great liberties, blending fact and myth until the truth was nearly obscured. One of the earliest fictionalized portrayals was in the 1984 film The Cotton Club, where a character loosely based on Bumpy appears amid the jazz era drama. But it was the 1997 film Hoodlum, starring Lawrence Fishburne as Bumpy and Cicely Tyson as Stephanie St. Clair, that put Bumpy's name in front of a wide audience. Hoodlum dramatized the 1930s numbers war and Bumpy's rise, but it played fast and loose with history. The film depicts Bumpy as a kind of idealistic gangster, activist, almost a Harlem folk revolutionary, who dared to cross swords with the mafia for the greater good. It even hints at Bumpy adopting a proto-civil rights stance, making him seem a cross between Robin Hood and Malcolm X, as one critic put it. In reality, as that same critic noted dryly, Johnson was an outgunned crook who had little choice but to collaborate with the mafia after a futile war with Schultz. Far from a triumphant conqueror of the mob, the real Bumpy ultimately worked as an enforcer for the Italians on mutually agreed terms. Hoodlum chose dramatic flair over accuracy, essentially rewriting Bumpy as a heroic figure and simplifying Madame St. Clair's role as well. It's an entertaining movie, but a viewer would come away with a very skewed impression of both Bumpy and St. Clair. Perhaps the most influential portrayal of Bumpy Johnson came from a surprising source, a former driver and flunky of his, Frank Lucas. Lucas rocketed to fame in 2007 as the subject of the Hollywood film American Gangster, in which Denzel Washington plays him. In the film's opening scene, a kindly, aging Bumpy Johnson, played by Clarence Williams III, dies in a Harlem appliance store with Lucas Washington at his side, imparting wisdom until the very end. It's a powerful scene establishing Bumpy as a beloved mentor and Harlem's underworld patriarch passing the torch. However, this is highly fictionalized. In real life, Bumpy died in a restaurant, and it's contested whether Frank Lucas was even present. Lucas claimed he was, others doubt it. Moreover, the notion that Bumpy taught Lucas everything, and that Lucas was his anointed successor, is largely Lucas's own myth-making. Those who knew Bumpy suggest that while Lucas was a small player around him, he was by no means Bumpy's top aide. Bumpy had multiple more trusted associates and a structured crew long before Lucas came along. But American Gangster, based on Lucas's embellished accounts, effectively repositioned Bumpy in the public consciousness as a stepping stone in someone else's story. The film's focus was on Frank Lucas. Bumpy appears only to hand him the keys to the kingdom and then exit. As a result, mainstream audiences learned little about Bumpy's own achievements or the context of his career. They saw just the dignified old godfather fading out, making way for the next star criminal. It's worth noting that by Lucas's telling, Bumpy Johnson was Harlem's underworld king, and Lucas simply inherited that throne intact. But many historians argue this is more myth than reality. Lucas's harrowing empire of the late 1960s was a separate phenomenon. Bumpy's death did not automatically make Lucas king. In fact, a multitude of factors and other players contributed to the 1970s drug scene. Lucas, however, cleverly invoked Bumpy's legendary name to bolster his own credibility. This is a prime example of how the Bumpy Johnson legend has been used and misused. To some extent, Bumpy became a regional legend, known in Harlem, but not nationally celebrated like Capone or Luciano. That left room for others to shape his narrative. In recent years, Bumpy Johnson's persona got another Hollywood makeover in the Apex television series Godfather of Harlem 2019, with Forrest Whitaker portraying him. The series, while inspired by real events, heavily fictionalizes Bumpy's post-prison years, inserting him into storylines with figures like Malcolm X and Adam Clayton Powell Jr. For dramatic effect, the show depicts Bumpy collaborating with Malcolm X in the early 1960s to disrupt the Italian mob's heroin supply. It's true that Bumpy and Malcolm X, then Malcolm Little, had known each other. Malcolm, as a young hustler in the 40s nicknamed Detroit Red, had crossed paths with Bumpy, and later, after Malcolm left the Nation of Islam in 1964, Bumpy allegedly offered him protection. However, Godfather of Harlem amplifies this into a central plot, which no historical evidence fully supports. The show, like many dramatizations, also sidelines or ignores earlier key figures like Madame St. Clair, since by the 1960s she was out of the picture. It thus contributes to the erasure of Saint Clair's legacy. More on that shortly, while further romanticizing Bumpy as a community-minded gangster. Even documentary treatments and books often toggle between portraying Bumpy as a ruthless crime boss and a sort of rogue hero. For instance, he's frequently credited with maintaining order in Harlem and preventing the kind of open bloodshed seen elsewhere. One consequence is that his genuine criminal ruthlessness, the dozens of murders he was implicated in during the 1930s, the drugs that ruined lives, gets underplayed in favor of the myth of the noble gangster. As The Guardian's analysis points out, some depictions have recast Bumpy as a visionary agent of social change, when in truth his priority was maintaining his power and profits. The same piece bluntly states, in reality, Johnson was an outgunned crook forced to seek help from the Cosa Nostra after a futile war. It's a needed reality check. The paradox of Bumpy Johnson's image is that for decades he was recognized in mainstream crime history, overshadowed by white gangsters. Yet in the modern era he's been mythologized in media as more virtuous or influential than he likely was. A 2007 Time magazine piece noted that Johnson has never officially entered the pantheon of mainstream American villains, remaining largely a local legend. There's truth to that. You won't find Bumpy in most history books next to Capone or Gotti. But through films and shows, he's finally gotten wider attention, albeit wrapped in layers of dramatic license. In short, popular media has distorted Bumpy Johnson's image by turning him into either a quasi-folk hero or a narrative prop, rather than the complex, flawed man he was. The real Bumpy was neither saint nor simple thug. He was a product of a racially segregated economy, A man who found power in the only arena society left open to black muggles of his era, the underground. To truly understand that, one must peel back the Hollywood veneer and look at the facts, as we've done here. If Bumpy Johnson's story has been skewed by legend, then Stephanie St. Clair's story has been outright marginalized for decades, omitted from popular narratives, or reduced to a footnote as Bumpy's boss lady in a few films like Hoodlum. Only recently have historians and writers begun to spotlight just how extraordinary her role was. In reevaluating St. Clair's significance, it becomes clear that she was far more than a gangster's sidekick or a colorful anecdote in Harlem lore. She was, in many ways, a pioneer of black entrepreneurship and empowerment, albeit through illicit means. Consider what Stephanie St. Clair achieved. She was a black woman immigrant who built $1 million enterprise in the 1920s, a time when both racism and sexism were stacked almost insurmountably against her. In a male-dominated underworld, she not only held her own, she dominated a sector, policy banking, in a major American city for nearly a decade. That alone is remarkable. Unlike the Italian mafia bosses, St. Clair did not have a large national network or familial organized crime structure backing her. She was essentially a freelancer, as one account put it, carving out territory with brains, bravado, and a knack for organization. Her success was not just in accruing wealth, but in how she used that position. St. Clair blurred the lines between illegality and community leadership. She leveraged her underworld clout to support legitimate causes, pushing for police reform, advocating for black immigrants' rights, and investing in black-owned businesses. She showed that one could be a numbers runner and still care about the uplift of one's people. This dual identity, criminal and activist, was highly unusual. Historian LaShawn Harris suggests that rather than dismiss St. Clair as an outlier, we should include her in discussions of black business and female leadership. After all, she ran a business that at its core involved finance, workforce management, and marketings cloaked in illegality, yes, but functionally a business. At the height of her career, St. Clair was employing dozens of black men and women, circulating money within the black community and turning a profit that rivaled that of mid-sized legitimate companies. In terms of sheer moxie, Stephanie St. Clair deserves recognition as one of the boldest figures in Harlem's history. Who else had the guts to stand up in 1930 and publicly accuse the NYPD of corruption, leading to real consequences for dirty cops? Who else would openly threaten a notoriously violent gangster like Dutch Schultz and not back down? St. Clair's life is a testament to audacity. Yes, she was involved in violent and illegal acts, but she also had a vision of economic self-determination for Black Harlem that was ahead of its time. During the Depression, when Buy Black campaigns urged African Americans to patronize black businesses, St. Clair applied that to the underworld. Play black. Keep the money in our community. It was a form of insurrection against the status quo of organized crime, which usually saw black neighborhoods as exploitable territories for outside gangs. In that sense, St. Clair can be seen as a sort of street-level black nationalist entrepreneur. Her fight with Schultz wasn't just personal, it carried a symbolic weight of black resistance to white encroachment, even if conducted through bullets and bribes rather than picket signs. Moreover, St. Clair's life sheds light on the experiences of black women in the early 20th century who refused to be confined by societal expectations. She did not fit the mold of the respectable, church-going matron nor the tragic victim. Instead, she crafted a persona of a power-wielding, outspoken black woman in an era when that was virtually unheard of outside of a few performers or activists. In doing so, she broadened the realm of what was possible, or at least imaginable, for women of her community. One historian commented that calling her a gangster might actually undersell her impact. What might be even more radical than calling her a female gangster is calling her a businesswoman, he said. That reframing places St. Clair in the pantheon of black entrepreneurial pioneers, albeit unorthodox ones, rather than in the gutter of mere criminality. Until recently, mainstream history books largely ignored Madame St. Clair. She wasn't white, she wasn't male, and her exploits were tied to a form of gambling considered low, class, and deviant. But contemporary scholarship is finally giving her due credit. She's now recognized as an important figure in studies of Black urban economics and the Harlem Renaissance era's social dynamics. Her story is taught as an example of how African Americans navigated both legitimate and illegitimate economies to survive and prosper in the face of exclusion from mainstream opportunities. In some, reevaluating Stephanie St, Clair highlights her as a woman who delineated the diverse ways in which Black New Yorkers employed informal economies to earn a living and contest urban inequality. She turned a numbers game into a platform for personal and communal power. That's a legacy far more significant than the caricature of a temperamental lady crime boss that she's often reduced to. Despite her considerable influence in Harlem's history, Stephanie St, Clair's story nearly vanished from collective memory for decades, overshadowed by male counterparts and omitted from the grand narratives of organized crime. This erasure was the result of both contemporaneous biases and later historical neglect. It serves as a cautionary tale of how race and gender can determine whose stories get told and celebrated. In the immediate aftermath of the 1930s, St. Clair's name faded from headlines. The fact that no newspaper bothered to print an obituary for her in 1969 is telling. By contrast, someone like Dutch Schultz, who died in 1935, has been immortalized in countless mafia books and movies as the archetypal prohibition gangster. The white gangsters and Italian, American mob bosses dominated the spotlight in crime lore. Black figures were often footnotes. Even Bumpy Johnson, as noted, was long considered a regional legend rather than a national figure. If Bumpy struggled for mainstream recognition, Stephanie St. Clair stood virtually no chance. A Black woman who ran a racket that didn't fit the popular image of the gangster era, which was typically portrayed as a boys' club of Tommy guns and fedoras. Mainstream narratives of the American underworld in the 20th century in Hollywood and in many history books largely ignored the role of Black organized crime or treated it as a sideshow. Thus, the Harlem policy racket was seldom given serious attention in the way the Italian mafia or Chicago syndicate were. When it was mentioned, the contributions of a woman like St. Clair were often minimized or misattributed to men. For example, Casper Holstein, a Black male numbers king in Harlem, got some historical due as a philanthropist and community figure, while St. Clair, who was at least as prominent, remained obscure. In many accounts of Bumpy Johnson's rise, you might see a brief note that he worked for a woman named Madame Stain, Clair, and nothing more, as if her only significance was giving Bumpy his start. Popular media compounded this. Films like American Gangster and the Godfather of Harlem series don't mention St. Clair at all. They begin Bumpy's story, essentially with Bumpy as the boss, as if he sprung up self-made or inherited power from an amorphous, earlier generation. This effectively writes Stephanie St. Clair out of her own narrative. Even Hoodlum, which is one of the few depictions to include her, places the emphasis on Bumpy as the protagonist, with St. Clair in a supporting, almost maternal role. The film fictionalizes her as Queenie, though clearly based on St. Clair, and portrays her as elegant and wise, but ultimately passing leadership to Bumpy as the hero. In reality, St. Clair was every bit the main character in the 1930s Harlem story, not a side character. This erasure also reflects a broader marginalization of women in crime history. Criminal enterprises run by women, especially women of color, were seldom taken as seriously by journalists or law enforcement of the time, unless the women were demonized as uniquely evil. St. Clair, interestingly, was sometimes vilified in the press. The Black press alternated between lauding her and decrying her antics. But the white press mostly ignored her except in relation to the more famous male gangsters. When she testified against police corruption, the white newspapers referred to her dismissively as a Negro wench, or not at all. Her achievements didn't fit the narrative they were interested in. By the time authors and scholars started examining Black organized crime in retrospect, late 20th century, a lot of primary sources on St. Clair were scattered or lost. It took researchers like Harris digging through Black newspapers, court archives, and oral histories to piece her story back together. Now that they have, it's clear that mainstream history missed a key figure. For example, the Harlem Renaissance era is often taught with a focus on arts and culture. Langston Hughes, Zora Neale Hurston, etc. Rarely do we acknowledge that at the same time, people like Stephanie St. Clair were shaping Harlem's economy on the streets. The numbers racket, as one scholar noted, was far more important to far more people in Harlem than the celebrated cultural salons of the Renaissance. It reached into the daily lives of housewives, laborers, and aspiring entrepreneurs. Not including St. Clair in the story of Harlem in the 1920s, 30s leaves out a huge part of the lived experience of that community. The good news is that recent works have begun to restore Madame St. Clair's name to the narrative. Articles in outlets like the Smithsonian Magazine and JSTOR Daily have profiled her, bringing her story to new audiences. Her bold quotes, "I'm not afraid of any other living man," are once again being read, admired, and understood in context. There's a growing recognition that the tale of organized crime in America isn't complete without figures like her. And beyond crime, that Harlem's history of entrepreneurship and activism has an unlikely character in its roster, a French Caribbean woman who ran an illegal lottery, yet also fought for justice in her own way. In some, mainstream narratives long erased Stephanie St. Clair's contributions due to a combination of racial bias, gender bias, and the tendency of crime history to lionize certain archetypes while ignoring others. But when we reinsert her into the story, the picture changes. We see that Bumpy Johnson did not rise in a vacuum. He was mentored and elevated by a powerful woman. We see that Harlem's underworld had significant female leadership. We see an early form of resistance to organized crime takeover led by a black woman. All of these nuances enrich the history and correct the record. As we conclude, it's worth reflecting on what this joint story of Bumpy Johnson and Stephanie St. Clair truly represents. It's not just a cop's and robber's tale or a curiosity about bygone gangsters. It's a window into the black urban experience in 20th century America, the ingenuity born from oppression, the blurred lines between illegality and survival, the community solidarity in the face of external threats, and yes, the internal conflicts and personal flaws of those who chose the path of the underworld. It's a story of two individuals who, each in their own style, refused to be subordinate Bumpy, refusing to be subordinate to the mafia without a fight, St. Clair refusing to be subordinate to the social constraints on black women. Their partnership and clashes with enemies show us a side of the American crime saga that is rarely spotlighted, a black, run criminal enterprise that stood its ground against the might of the mafia and made its mark on history. And while they lived by the sword Zevras, and certainly profited from vice, both Bumpy Johnson and Madame St. Clair also forged legacies in their community, be it folklore of Bumpy's generosity or memories of St. Clair's audacity that outlast purely negative notoriety. Today, as historians and writers peel back the layers of myth, the real Bumpy and the real St. Clair stand forth as complex, fascinating characters. They don't need romanticizing or sanitizing. Their true exploits are compelling enough. Bumpy Johnson, a poet with a pistol. A Harlem Robin Hood who also dealt in deadly drugs. Stephanie St. Clair, a fearless female tycoon of the underground who advocated for black rights while ordering hits on rivals. These are Shakespearean figures on the stage of Harlem. And finally, they are getting their due in the annals of American history, not as footnotes, but as central characters in a drama of power, race, and resilience.